It's called the Forgotten War, squeezed between the glory of World War II and the trauma of Vietnam, a brutal 3-year stalemate most people can barely place on a map. But economically, it may be the single most important war America ever fought, because this is the war that made America's war economy permanent. Before it, America always disarmed after victory, sent the soldiers home and cut the budget. After it, America never truly disarmed again. This is the war you're still paying for. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. This is War Economics. To understand why, you have to picture America in early 1950 because it looks nothing like the America you know today. World War II had ended just 5 years earlier, and the country had done what it always did after a war. It went home. The vast wartime military was dismantled. The colossal defense budget was slashed. In 1950, the United States spent around $13 billion a year on its military, roughly 5% of the economy. President Truman was actively trying to keep military spending down, focused on balancing the budget after the enormous deaths of the war. This was the American tradition, going all the way back to the founding. You build a huge army to fight a war, and the moment the war is won, you tear it back down. A large standing military in peacetime was seen as expensive and even a little un-American. But there was a document sitting in Washington that wanted to shatter that tradition completely. In April of 1950, a top-secret policy paper was drafted, known to history as NSC 68. Written largely by a strategist named Paul Nitze, it painted the Cold War in the starkest possible terms, an existential, world-splitting struggle against the Soviet Union that America was dangerously unprepared for. And it made a radical demand. The United States must massively and permanently rearm. It called for roughly tripling the defense budget, pushing military spending toward $40 or $50 billion a year, indefinitely. It was, in essence, a proposal to turn America into a permanent military superpower on a permanent war footing. And when it landed on desks in Washington, the reaction was, absolutely not. The numbers were considered politically impossible and financially reckless. Tripling defense spending in peacetime? No president could sell that to a Congress and a public desperate to enjoy post-war prosperity, not fund tanks. NSC 68 was a plan without a prayer of being funded. It sat on the shelf, going nowhere. And then, on June the 25th, 1950, North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea, and everything changed. Hold on to that rejected document, because the war in Korea was about to take a plan nobody would pay for and turn it into the permanent foundation of the American economy. Because the invasion seemed to prove, overnight, everything NSC 68 had warned about. To Truman and his advisors, this was communist aggression in action, proof that the Soviet threat was real, expansionist, and had to be met with overwhelming force. Almost nobody in Washington knew that the Soviets hadn't actually ordered the invasion. What mattered was that it looked like the opening move of exactly the global communist offensive Nitze had described. As Secretary of State Dean Acheson later put it, Korea created the stimulus that made action possible. The document that had been impossible to fund in May became urgent national policy by September, when Truman formally signed it. The war provided the political fuel to do what had been unthinkable weeks before. Quick pause. This is exactly what this channel is built for, the money machinery underneath the history everyone thinks they know. If that's your thing, subscribing genuinely helps the next one get made. Now watch the number that changed America forever. Because the defense budget didn't just rise, it exploded. That $13 billion a year rocketed upward to over $50 billion by 1953. As a share of the entire American economy, military spending nearly tripled, leaping from around 5% to over 14%. The armed forces swelled from around 1.5 million people to nearly 3 million. America went, in about 3 years, from a nation winding its military down to a nation armed to the teeth in a way it had never been in peacetime. And Congress passed the Defense Production Act, handing the government sweeping powers to direct American industry toward military needs, a law so useful it remains on the books and in use to this day. But here's the part that truly matters, the part that outlived the war by generations. When every previous American war had ended, the spending came back down. The army shrank. The factories went back to making civilian goods. That is the pattern that had held for over a century and a half. This time, it didn't happen. After Korea, the spending never went back to where it had been. America had crossed a line, and it never crossed back. It built, for the first time in its history, a permanent war economy. A huge standing military kept ready at all times, enormous defense budgets baked in year after year, and a vast permanent arms industry of contractors and laboratories dependent on a constant flow of government money. Companies like Boeing and General Electric expanded massively into defense and never looked back. This is the birth of what President Eisenhower, the general who won World War II, would, a decade later, famously and nervously call the military-industrial complex. And Korea is the moment it became permanent. And that permanent war economy reshaped America far beyond the Pentagon's budget line. Just 3 years earlier, in 1947, the United States had created the modern architecture of national security, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the National Security Council. Korea's money is what filled those new institutions with life and made them permanent fixtures of American government, giving rise to what historians call the national security state. The flood of defense dollars also began to reshape the physical economy itself. Entire regions were transformed by military spending. The aerospace industry of Southern California, the electronics and research hubs, the web of military bases across the South and West that became economic lifelines for whole communities. Defense contracts became one of the largest and most reliable engines of American industry. And crucially, the government became the great funder of science and technology, pouring money into research labs and universities to develop weapons, radar, computers, and aviation. Much of the technological ecosystem that would later give the world the jet age, the space program, and even the early internet was seeded by this permanent river of military research money. War spending didn't just build weapons, it quietly rewired the entire structure of the American economy. Think about what that means. The entire Cold War arms race we covered in another video, the trillions of dollars, the tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, all of it ran on the permanent war economy that Korea locked into place. The pattern would repeat for decades. American defense spending would spike again for Vietnam, again under Reagan, and again after the September 11th attacks. But the baseline never fell back to the pre-Korea world. The garrisoning of the globe began here, too. Permanent American military bases spreading across Europe, Japan, and Korea itself, where tens of thousands of U.S. troops remain stationed to this very day. Korea didn't just fund a war, it rewired the American state into a permanent military power, and handed the country a bill it has been paying every single year for over 70 years. And notice how the true nature of it was softened even at the time. The Korean War was never formally declared a war at all. President Truman called it a police action, a limited operation under the banner of the United Nations, a phrase that quietly downplayed what it really was. Because it was, in fact, a massive and bloody conflict. Around 36,000 American troops were killed, and the total death toll across all sides, soldiers and civilians, ran into the millions. It reshaped the American economy for generations and cost tens of thousands of American lives while being labeled something less than a full war. The gap between what it was called and what it actually cost is its own kind of hidden bill. Now, here's a detail that makes Korea genuinely different from the wars that came after it, and it's about how the bill got paid. Unlike Vietnam, which was funded with hidden money and inflation, and unlike the War on Terror, which was put entirely on the national credit card, Korea was largely paid for honestly and upfront. President Truman raised taxes to fund it, pushing through higher income taxes and a steep excess profits tax on corporations. And he used wartime price controls to hold down the inflation that surged when the fighting began. It was, in a sense, one of the last times for a long while that America taxed itself to pay for a war as it was fighting it, rather than borrowing the cost and shoving it onto the future. The permanent war economy Korea created would prove enormously expensive, but the Korean War itself, at least, America actually paid for as it went. And there's one final twist to this war, and it's one of the strangest economic stories of the 20th century, because the war that devastated Korea secretly resurrected the economy of a completely different country. That country was Japan. Just 5 years earlier, America had bombed Japan flat and left its economy in ruins. But now, with a massive war raging right next door, the U.S. military needed a nearby industrial base to supply it trucks, uniforms, equipment, supplies, repairs, everything an army consumes. And Japan was perfectly placed. American military dollars came flooding into Japanese factories, hundreds of millions of dollars in orders in a single year, so much that one report described Japan as almost bulging with dollars. This flood of American war spending kick-started Japanese industry and lit the fuse on what would become the Japanese economic miracle, the astonishing rise that would turn Japan into the second-largest economy on Earth. A Japanese leader reportedly described the Korean War procurement boom as a gift from the gods. The same country America had firebombed in one war was economically reborn by America's next war just across the sea. And the war left behind one more economic legacy, frozen along that dividing line, the single most brutal experiment the modern world has ever run. When the fighting stopped, one people, one nation, one culture was left split in two at the 38th parallel, and the two halves set off down opposite economic roads. The South, tied to the American system, market-based and trade-driven, would over the following decades become one of the wealthiest, most advanced economies on the planet. The North, sealed off under rigid communist central planning, would become one of the poorest and most isolated. Same people, same starting point, same devastation in 1953, and today the gap between them is so enormous it can be seen from space, where the South blazes with electric light and the North sits in near total darkness. It is the clearest illustration ever produced of how much the economic system a country chooses can shape the fate of everyone living in it. So step back and look at the whole picture. The Korean War ended in July of 1953, almost exactly where it had begun, a stalemate along the 38th parallel, a ceasefire but no peace treaty, a conflict that technically has never even formally ended. In military terms, it produced no clear victory, which is a big part of why it faded from memory. But economically, it is arguably the most consequential war in modern American history. It took a rejected plan to triple defense spending and made it permanent national policy. It gave birth to the permanent military-industrial complex and the trillion-dollar defense budgets that define America today, a country that now spends more on its military than the next 10 nations combined, a direct inheritance of the machine Korea built. And it set the pattern of global military commitment that costs America hundreds of billions of dollars every year without end. That's the pattern this whole channel exists to expose. Every war has a second front made of money, and the Korean War is the one where America quietly and permanently put its economy on a war footing and simply never took it off. It's called the Forgotten War, but it may be the one you're still paying for right now. If you made it this far, you're exactly who war economics is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next ledger.